The eviction notice was taped to the apartment door when Eli Brennan returned from dropping his daughter at school, the bright orange paper impossible to ignore in the gray December morning. 7 days to vacate. He'd known it was coming, had been dodging the landlord's calls for 3 weeks, but seeing it in writing made the threat real in a way that phone messages hadn't. His daughter Maya was 10 years old, and Eli was about to make her homeless 2 weeks before Christmas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He pulled the notice down carefully, folding it and putting it in his jacket pocket where Maya wouldn't see it when she got home from school. She'd been through enough this year, her mother leaving in March with a note that said she couldn't handle the pressure anymore, Eli losing his job at the architectural firm in June when the company downsized, the slow descent from comfortable middle-class life to counting pennies for groceries and praying the car didn't break down because repairs were impossible. The bank statement in his other pocket showed $273, everything he had left after paying for Maya's school supplies and winter clothes that mostly fit. Not enough for rent, not enough for deposit on a new place, barely enough to keep them fed until whatever came next. Eli had applied for dozens of jobs, had interviews that went nowhere, had watched his savings evaporate while creditors called with increasing urgency. He spent the morning on his laptop at the library where internet was free, searching rental listings he couldn't afford and job postings that wanted experience he didn't have. Around noon, a county liquidation notice caught his eye, different from the rental ads, stranger. Old Riverside Pottery Works, complete facility including kilns and equipment, selling for salvage. Minimum bid $400. The photographs showed a sprawling brick complex that looked like it had been slowly dying for decades, industrial buildings arranged around a central courtyard, massive beehive kilns rising like monuments to an era when pottery was made by hand in structures designed to last centuries. The listing noted the property had been county seized for unpaid taxes, was being sold as is for salvage only, buyer responsible for demolition and removal. Eli knew pottery, had studied ceramic arts before switching to architecture, understood that old kiln works contained valuable materials if you knew what to look for. Fire brick from kilns built in the 1800s was worth serious money to people restoring historic structures. The equipment, potter's wheels, clay mixers, vintage glazing tools, could sell to collectors and working potters. Even the building materials, if carefully salvaged, represented income. He did quick calculations on paper already covered with job search notes. If he bid the minimum $400 and won, if he worked fast and methodical, if he could salvage the highest value items before the 7-day eviction deadline, he might clear $3,000. Enough to pay rent, buy time, keep Maya housed while he continued searching for steady work. It was desperate gambling with money he didn't have, but desperation was pretty much his permanent state now. The auction was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Eli spent the rest of the day researching pottery salvage values, planning how he'd approach the work, calculating whether this insane plan might actually keep them off the street. That evening, after Maya was asleep, Eli counted out $400 in 20s from the money that was supposed to stretch until something broke in their favor. If he won the bid, they'd have $73 left for groceries. If he didn't win, they'd still be broke but at least wouldn't have gambled away money they desperately needed. He barely slept, his mind churning through logistics and fear, trying to figure out how to salvage a pottery works in 7 days while keeping Maya fed and safe and unaware that her father was one disaster away from complete collapse. The auction happened in the same courthouse where Eli had filed bankruptcy papers 6 months earlier, a connection that felt both ironic and inevitable. The room was nearly empty. Maybe 5 people scattered across folding chairs, all of them looking like professional salvagers or scrap dealers who knew exactly what they were bidding on. Eli sat in the back with Maya, who'd insisted on coming when he tried to arrange for their neighbor to watch her. She held his hand, her small fingers warm in his, both of them understanding that this auction mattered in ways that went beyond property acquisition. The auctioneer worked through several properties before reaching the pottery works, his voice taking on a warning tone when he described what was being sold. Property requires complete demolition, multiple structures in advanced decay, environmental assessments recommend careful handling of materials. buyer assumes all liability. Minimum bid $400. Eli raised his hand, his heart hammering hard enough he thought people in the front row could probably hear it. 400 from bidder 12. Do I hear 425? Silence. Eli waited for someone to outbid him, for a professional salvager to recognize value he'd spotted, but the room stayed quiet. These were people who knew pottery salvage, who'd probably already calculated that the work required exceeded the profit potential. Going once at 400. Going twice. Eli held his breath. Sold to bidder 12 for $400. Maya squeezed his hand, her face showing careful hope mixed with the caution that came from a year of disappointments. We bought a pottery factory. We bought salvage rights to one. Now we have to work really hard to make it worth what we paid. At the clerk's window, Eli counted out $400 in 20s, each bill representing food or utilities or security they were surrendering for the chance that pottery salvage could save them. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Helen, processed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The Riverside works, she said, not quite a question. Been empty since the early 80s when Martin Caldwell shut it down. Family tried to keep it going but couldn't compete with mass production. She slid the deed across the counter. Good luck with the salvage. That place has a lot of history. The pottery works sat on the eastern edge of town where Riverside Road curved to follow Mill Creek, a sprawling complex of brick buildings that looked simultaneously impressive and abandoned. The main structure was 3 stories, its massive beehive kilns visible even from the road, smaller workshops and storage buildings arranged around a central courtyard that had probably been beautiful when the pottery was operational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eli parked his car in the gravel lot where delivery trucks had once loaded finished pottery, looking at what he'd purchased with money they couldn't spare. Up close, the decay was more evident. Broken windows, graffiti on lower walls, sections of roof that had clearly been leaking for years. But the bones were solid, brick construction from an era when industrial buildings were made to last, the kiln structures themselves looking remarkably intact despite decades of neglect. It's really big, Maya said, her voice carrying both awe and uncertainty. It is. Which means lots of materials to salvage if we're smart about it. Eli pulled out the keys Helen had given him, old brass that suggested they'd been with the property since Martin Caldwell's time. Come on, let's see what we're dealing with. The main entrance opened to a vast production floor, 2 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by iron beams and timber trusses. Potter's wheels stood in rows, maybe 50 of them, covered in dust but seemingly intact. Long wooden tables lined the walls, workspaces where artisans had shaped and glazed pottery for over a century. The massive kilns dominated the far wall, their beehive shapes rising through multiple floors, brick structures that had once burned hot enough to transform clay into ceramic. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the December air. The space smelled of old clay and mildew and time, the scent of processes and materials most of the modern world had abandoned. Eli found himself responding to it viscerally, his background in ceramic arts recognizing the quality of what Caldwell had built here. Maya stayed close to him, her hand finding his as they explored. Did people really make all their dishes and cups here? Not in factories? This was a factory, but a different kind. People making things by hand, using skills that took years to learn, creating pottery that was beautiful and functional. Eli pointed to shelves still holding examples of the work, plates and bowls and vases in various stages of completion, abandoned when the pottery closed. Martin Caldwell specialized in high-quality stoneware, the kind of pottery people kept for generations. They climbed carefully to the second floor, testing each step before trusting weight to stairs that had seen decades of neglect. The upper level held what appeared to be administrative offices and storage rooms, spaces where the business side of pottery production had happened. Most rooms were empty except for debris and water damage, but one larger office showed signs of more recent occupation. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but still intact. filing cabinets lined one wall, most hanging open and empty. A framed photograph hung askew, showing a stern-looking man in work clothes standing in front of the kilns, probably Martin Caldwell himself during the Pottery's working years. Eli was examining the kiln's condition when he noticed something odd about the office floor. Most of it was standard industrial flooring, but one section near the back wall showed different coloring, as if it had been replaced or modified at some point. He pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to examine the scene more closely. The flooring in that section wasn't nailed down like the rest, it was sitting loose, held in place by friction and years of accumulated debris. Eli worked his fingers under the edge, lifting carefully, finding that the boards came up to reveal a brick-lined shaft descending into darkness below the main floor level. "Maya, come hold the flashlight." She positioned the light while Eli removed more flooring, revealing a narrow staircase descending about 12 feet to what appeared to be a brick-lined chamber. The construction was different from the Pottery's main structure, older maybe, or built for a purpose that required more substantial foundation. "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice carrying curiosity rather than fear. "I don't know. Storage maybe, or a foundation chamber for the kilns." Eli tested the stairs carefully, finding them solid despite their age. "Stay here, let me check it out." He descended slowly, his phone's flashlight illuminating brick walls and a packed earth floor, the air cooler and drier than the decaying structure above. The chamber was maybe 15 feet square, its ceiling supported by brick arches that suggested serious engineering. Unlike the pottery works above, this space showed no signs of water damage or decay, it had been sealed well enough that time had barely touched it. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, and on those shelves sat hundreds of ceramic pieces. Not the utilitarian stoneware the pottery had been known for, but art pottery, vases and sculptures and decorative pieces that showed extraordinary craftsmanship. Eli recognized the style immediately, the kind of work that appeared in museum collections and brought serious money at auction. He moved deeper into the chamber, his flashlight revealing more. A wooden desk sat against the far wall, papers carefully stacked and preserved by the dry air. A metal filing cabinet stood beside it, and next to that, a large iron safe. Eli approached the desk, finding a leather-bound journal on top, its cover embossed with initials, M.C. Martin Caldwell. He opened it carefully, finding pages filled with neat handwriting, entries dated from the 1970s through early 1980s, the years when the pottery was struggling to survive. The first entry he read made his hands start shaking. January 15, 1981. "I'm sealing this chamber today, hiding what I should have shared but couldn't bear to see scattered or sold to collectors who'd only care about value. These pieces represent my life's real work, not the production pottery that paid bills, but the art I created when beauty mattered more than profit. I've been making them for 40 years, keeping them separate from the commercial operation, creating something that would outlast the business I inherited and couldn't save. The pottery works is failing. I can't compete with cheap imported ceramics, can't convince people to pay fair prices for quality handwork when they can buy mass-produced items for a fraction of the cost. I'll close by year's end, sell the equipment, pay what debts I can. But these pieces, hundreds of them, my finest work, I'm hiding them here where they'll wait for someone who understands what they represent. If you found this chamber, you found my legacy. Not the pottery that kept workers employed or paid my bills, but the art that kept me sane when commerce was killing craftsmanship. Take them, sell them, do whatever serves your needs. Just know they were made with care by someone who believed beauty had value even when the market disagreed." Eli read the entry 3 times, his mind struggling to process what this meant. He examined the pieces on the shelves more closely, recognizing museum-quality work, pottery that would bring thousands of dollars per piece from collectors who valued traditional craftsmanship. He counted quickly, hundreds of pieces, maybe 500 total. "Dad?" Maya's voice came from above, worried by how long he'd been down there. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just found something unexpected." Eli climbed back up, his mind racing. "There's a hidden chamber under the office. Martin Caldwell sealed his personal art collection down there before closing the pottery. Hundreds of pieces, all high-quality work. Maya's eyes widened. Like treasure? Kind of, yeah. Like treasure that's worth serious money if we can figure out how to handle it right. That evening, after Maya was asleep in their apartment that would be someone else's in 6 days, Eli sat at the kitchen table researching Martin Caldwell's pottery. What he found made his chest tight with possibilities and problems. Caldwell had been regionally famous in the 60s and 70s, his art pottery featured in galleries and exhibitions, his work collected by people who valued traditional American ceramics. But he disappeared from the art world in the early 80s, his pottery closed, his work vanishing from market circulation. Museum curators and collectors had wondered what happened to his final pieces, speculated that he'd destroyed them rather than sell at reduced prices when the pottery closed. But Eli had found them, sealed in a chamber Caldwell had built specifically to preserve his legacy until someone worthy discovered it. The pieces were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more if properly authenticated and sold. Enough to change everything for Eli and Maya, to transform desperate poverty into security he hadn't known since before his wife left. But he had 6 days before eviction, no authentication, no connections to the art pottery market, and a discovery that would attract attention from people who'd been waiting 40 years for Caldwell's final work to surface. He spent 3 more days researching, photographing pieces, documenting everything in the chamber while also beginning salvage work on the pottery's equipment and materials. The fire brick from the kilns was valuable as he'd expected, the vintage potter's wheels finding buyers through online marketplaces, the architectural salvage from the building itself bringing income that kept them fed while he figured out what to do about Caldwell's hidden collection. On the 4th day, a truck pulled into the pottery's gravel lot, newer and cleaner than anything else in this part of town. 2 men got out, both wearing work clothes that were too clean, their posture suggesting they weren't here for casual conversation. Eli met them outside, positioning himself between them and the building, his phone ready in his pocket. "Can I help you?" The older man stepped forward, maybe 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. "Name's Richard Foster. This is my son Tom. We're interested in buying the pottery works from you. I just bought it 4 days ago." "We know. We've been waiting for it to go to auction, planned to bid ourselves but got delayed." Richard pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "We're offering to buy your salvage rights. $10,000, transfer happens within a week. You walk away with a profit and don't have to deal with demolition work. $10,000. Last week it would have seemed like salvation. Now, knowing what was hidden beneath the office floor, it was an insult or a test. Why do you want it?" "Investment. We develop properties, see potential in the location. The pottery building would need to be demolished, but the land itself is valuable. And you're offering $10,000 for property you plan to demolish?" Eli kept his voice neutral, but his mind was racing. These men knew something, suspected or had heard rumors about what Caldwell might have hidden. Tom spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge his father's didn't. "We're offering fair compensation for a structure that's going to cost you time and money to salvage. Most people in your situation would jump at the opportunity. What do you know about Martin Caldwell's final work?" Eli asked directly. Richard's expression shifted, revealing calculation beneath the friendly facade. "We know he was creating museum-quality art pottery right up until he closed. No, those pieces never appeared on the market, no collectors have been searching for them for 40 years. If you found something in that building, it should be properly authenticated and sold through appropriate channels. And you're those appropriate channels? We have connections in the art pottery market. Can help you get fair value if you've discovered Caldwell's final collection." Richard paused. "Or we can buy the property outright and handle everything ourselves. Either way, you should accept help when it's offered." Eli recognized the threat beneath the offer, understood these men were probably going to make things difficult if he refused. But he thought about Caldwell's journal entry, about hiding art because he couldn't bear to see it scattered or sold to collectors who only cared about value. "I need to think about it." "You've got 48 hours, Tom said, dropping the friendly pretense entirely. "After that, we'll find other ways to acquire what should have been ours to begin with." After they left, Eli stood in the gravel lot trying to process this new complication. The Fosters knew about Caldwell's hidden work, had been waiting for the property to become available, saw Eli as an obstacle to something they'd been pursuing for years. They could make salvage work impossible, could pressure and threaten and use resources Eli didn't have. But Caldwell's journal had been clear. He'd hidden the pottery for someone who understood what it represented, not for collectors who only saw value. Eli had found the chamber because he was desperate and thorough, because he needed salvage income and had looked carefully at every aspect of the building. That discovery came with obligation he was trying to understand. That evening he called a ceramics professor he'd studied under in college, a woman named Dr. Sarachin who specialized in American art pottery and who'd taught him to recognize quality craftsmanship. He explained what he'd found, sent photographs of several pieces, waited while she examined them. When she called back, her voice was shaking with excitement. "Eli, these are authentic Martin Caldwell pieces, probably from his final years. Do you understand what you found? The art pottery community has been searching for this work for 4 decades. If you've got hundreds of pieces like these photographs, you're looking at a collection worth potentially millions." Millions? Caldwell's early work brings $50,000 to $75,000 per piece at auction. His final work, which nobody's seen, could be worth even more. You've found his artistic legacy, the pieces he considered his masterwork. Sarah paused. But you need to be careful. News of this discovery will bring people who see only dollar signs, who'll try to pressure you into selling fast and cheap. Already happening. 2 men offered to buy the property for $10,000 this afternoon. Don't sell. Not to them, not to anyone until you understand what you have and what it's worth. I can help with authentication, can connect you with museums and ethical collectors, can make sure this is handled right. Her voice grew more serious. But Eli, people have been waiting for Caldwell's final work to surface. Some of them will do whatever it takes to acquire it. Over the next 2 days, while the eviction deadline approached and the Fosters' 48-hour ultimatum ran out, Eli worked with Sarah to document and authenticate the collection. She drove 6 hours to examine the pieces personally, brought equipment to photograph and catalog everything, treated the discovery with the reverence it deserved. "This is extraordinary," she said, examining a vase that showed Caldwell's mastery of glazing techniques. "Museum quality, every piece." He spent his final years creating a body of work that represents the peak of his abilities, then hid it rather than see it sold during the pottery's liquidation. His journal said he was hiding it for someone who'd understand what it represented. You're that someone. You found it because you were desperate for salvage income and looked carefully at the building's structure. Caldwell would have appreciated that, finding his legacy by accident while pursuing necessity. Sarah set down the vase carefully. "What do you want to do with it?" It was the question Eli had been avoiding, the choice between immediate financial salvation and honoring Caldwell's trust. The Fosters want to buy the property, claim they have connections to sell the pottery properly. But something about them feels wrong. The Fosters have been hunting Caldwell's final work for years. Richard's father was a ceramics dealer who tried to buy the pottery when Caldwell was struggling, offered prices too low to save the business but high enough to acquire the collection if Martin had been willing to sell. Martin refused, closed the pottery rather than surrender his art to dealers who saw only profit. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Eli articles about the Foster family's art dealing business. They've built wealth buying collections from desperate families, from estates that don't know what they have. They're not unethical exactly, but they prioritize profit over preservation. So what's the alternative? Museums. Educational institutions. Collectors who value Caldwell's work beyond investment potential. I can facilitate connections, help you sell pieces in ways that honor what Martin built while providing security for you and Maya. The eviction deadline arrived with Eli no closer to solving his immediate crisis. The pottery collection was worth a fortune, but converting that worth to actual money required time and authentication and finding the right buyers. Meanwhile, rent was due when the landlord wouldn't accept promises about art pottery sales that might happen eventually. He was packing their apartment when Sarah called with an unexpected solution. I've been talking to the Riverside Art Museum, showing them photographs of the collection. They want to acquire the entire body of work, display it as the Martin Caldwell Legacy Collection, ensure the pieces stay together rather than being scattered through private sales. How long would that take? I'm getting evicted today. They've offered an immediate down payment of $50,000 against the full purchase price, which their appraisers estimate at $2 to $3 million once everything's authenticated. The $50,000 would be yours today if you're willing to work with them. Eli felt the walls that had been closing in suddenly retreat. $50,000 was more money than he'd ever had at once, was security beyond anything he'd imagined when he bid $400 on Pottery salvage rights. What do I need to do? The museum's representative arrived that afternoon, a curator named Michael Torres who examined the collection with reverence that reminded Eli of Sarah's approach. He treated each piece as art rather than commodity, valued craftsmanship over investment potential, saw in Caldwell's work the kind of beauty that deserved preservation. This is museum quality throughout, Michael said, carefully photographing a sculptural piece that showed Caldwell's technical mastery. We display it as a complete collection, show how his work evolved over 40 years, tell the story of a craftsman who chose to hide his legacy rather than sell it to people who wouldn't value it properly. The paperwork was surprisingly straightforward. Eli transferred rights to the collection in exchange for the down payment and a percentage of the final authentication value, with the understanding that the museum would handle all authentication and display. The $50,000 check cleared the next day, money that transformed his and Maya's lives from desperate to secure. He paid the overdue rent, bought them time in the apartment while he figured out next steps. But the Fosters weren't done. Richard appeared at the Pottery 2 days after the museum deal was finalized, his friendly facade completely gone. "You made a mistake," Richard said, his voice hard. "That collection should have gone through proper art market channels, should have been sold to collectors who'd appreciate its investment value. Instead you gave it to a museum that will lock it away where nobody can enjoy it properly. Museums preserve work for future generations. That's what Caldwell wanted. Caldwell was a fool who died broke because he refused to adapt to market realities. You're making the same mistake, choosing preservation over profit." Richard stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "We could have sold that collection for 3 times what the museum's paying you. Could have made you wealthy instead of just comfortable. But the pieces would have been scattered, sold to private collectors who'd lock them in vaults as investments. Caldwell specifically said he wanted to avoid that. Caldwell's been dead for 20 years. His wants don't matter anymore." Richard's voice dropped to a threat. "You've made enemies of people who have long memories and patient approaches to getting what they want. That might have consequences you haven't considered." After Richard left, Eli stood in the Pottery Works trying to process the threat while also recognizing he'd chosen a path that honored what Caldwell had built rather than just exploiting it for maximum profit. The museum deal provided security, yes, but more importantly it ensured Caldwell's legacy would be preserved and shared rather than scattered among collectors who saw only investment value. The months that followed brought complications the Fosters had promised. Richard filed legal challenges claiming the Pottery collection had been improperly sold, that as longtime family friends of the Caldwells they had first right of refusal. The challenges failed. Eli had clear ownership through the county auction, and Caldwell's journal made his intentions explicit, but they cost time and legal fees that ate into the museum's down payment. But they also brought unexpected support. The art pottery community rallied around the museum acquisition. Ceramicists and collectors who valued preservation over profit wrote articles and gave interviews supporting the decision to keep Caldwell's final work together. The publicity brought attention to the Pottery Works itself, to the building where Caldwell had created his legacy, and to questions about what should happen to the structure now that its hidden treasure had been removed. Maya had watched all of this unfold with the careful attention of a 10-year-old trying to understand how their lives had transformed from desperate to stable. "Are we going to keep the Pottery building?" she asked one evening while Eli was reviewing legal documents. "I don't know yet. The salvage work is half finished, and now with all this attention on Caldwell's legacy, just tearing it down feels wrong. Could we fix it up? Make it work again?" Eli thought about this, about the massive kilns and the production floor and the space that had been designed for creating beauty through craft. That would take a lot of money and time. But maybe that's what should happen. Maybe Caldwell's building deserves the same preservation as Pottery is getting. Over the next year, as the museum completed authentication and began planning the Caldwell Legacy exhibition, Eli started exploring options for the pottery works itself. The building had historical significance beyond just housing Caldwell's hidden collection. It represented an era of American ceramic production, contained equipment and structures that were increasingly rare as old potteries were demolished. He found allies in the historical preservation community, people who valued industrial heritage and who saw in the Riverside Pottery Works the kind of building worth saving. They helped him navigate grants and funding, connected him with craftspeople who understood old kilns and production equipment, guided him toward a vision of the pottery as working museum rather than just salvage site. The transformation took 3 years and most of the money from the museum's final payment for Caldwell's collection. But slowly, carefully, the pottery was restored. The kilns were brought back to operational status, the production floor cleaned and equipped with vintage tools, the workshops converted to teaching spaces where traditional ceramic techniques could be learned and practiced. Maya was 13 when the pottery reopened, old enough to understand the journey from desperate salvage bid to restored heritage site, to see how her father's choice to honor Caldwell's trust had created something larger than immediate profit. She'd become interested in ceramics herself, spent time learning from the master potters who came to teach at the restored works, developed skills that connected her to traditions Caldwell had practiced. The Fosters had finally stopped their legal challenges, though Richard had made it clear he considered Eli's choices wasteful and short-sighted. "You could have been wealthy," he'd said during their final confrontation. "Instead you're running a non-profit pottery that will struggle to break even, preserving skills nobody values anymore." Caldwell valued them. The people learning here value them. That matters more than wealth I'd have gained by scattering his life's work among collectors who'd lock it in vaults. The museum's Caldwell Legacy exhibition opened 5 years after Eli had bought the pottery for salvage, drawing crowds who came to see work that had been hidden for 40 years. The pieces were displayed chronologically, showing how Caldwell's style had evolved from functional beauty to pure artistry, how he'd spent his final years creating work that represented the peak of his technical and creative abilities. Eli attended the opening with Maya, both of them standing before pieces they'd first seen in a hidden chamber beneath a decaying office. Dr. Sarachin gave a speech about Caldwell's legacy, about how his choice to hide his final work had preserved it until someone who'd honor his intentions discovered it. "Martin Caldwell could have sold these pieces during his lifetime," Sarah said, gesturing to the displayed pottery. "Could have accepted reduced prices from dealers who'd have scattered them among collectors. Instead he chose to hide them, to trust that eventually someone would find them who'd understand what they represented. Eli Brennan found them because he was desperate and thorough, because he needed salvage income and looked carefully at every aspect of the building. That discovery honored Caldwell's trust." After the opening, Eli walked through the exhibition with Maya, reading the interpretive text that explained each piece's significance, seeing how Caldwell's work had been contextualized within the broader history of American ceramics. The final display case held Caldwell's journal, open to the entry about sealing the chamber and hiding his legacy. "He knew someone would find it eventually," Maya said, reading the entry. "He had faith that the right person would come along. Or maybe he just hoped. Sometimes hope is all you can manage when circumstances are desperate." The Pottery Works thrived over the following years, becoming a regional center for traditional ceramics education, drawing students who wanted to learn skills that mass production had made obsolete. The restored kilns fired clay using methods Caldwell would have recognized. The teaching workshops passed forward knowledge that connected present practice to centuries of tradition. Eli found purpose in the work that went beyond salvaging his family's financial situation. He'd stumbled into preserving Caldwell's legacy through desperation meeting opportunity, through choices made to honor trust rather than maximize profit. The pottery had given him more than the money that saved them from eviction. It had given him a mission that transformed personal survival into community service. Maya graduated high school with plans to study ceramic arts in college, to learn the theory behind the practice she'd grown up around. She'd become the Pottery's youngest teaching assistant at 16, instructing beginners in techniques she'd mastered through years of proximity to skilled craftspeople. Caldwell's legacy had shaped her understanding of craft and beauty and the value of work done carefully for its own sake rather than purely for profit. On a warm evening in late spring, 10 years after Eli had bought the pottery for salvage and found Caldwell's hidden collection, the works hosted its annual exhibition of student pottery. The pieces showed varying skill levels, beginners' first bowls alongside advanced students' complex sculptural work, but all demonstrated the kind of careful attention Caldwell had valued. Eli walked through the exhibition thinking about the journey from desperate $400 bid to thriving heritage site, about the choices that had led here and the people whose lives had been changed by proximity to Caldwell's preserved legacy. The pottery that was supposed to provide emergency salvage income had become something far more significant, had honored a dead man's trust while creating a living institution that would outlive everyone currently involved. Richard Foster attended the exhibition, his presence surprising given years of conflict over the collection's disposition. He was older now, his earlier aggression replaced by something that might have been grudging respect. "You built something here," he said, watching students demonstrate throwing techniques on vintage wheels. "Not what I would have chosen, not what would have maximized profit, but something that matters in ways I didn't understand when we first met." Caldwell knew what he was doing when he hid his work. He trusted that whoever found it would honor what it represented rather than just sell it for maximum value. "I spent 40 years looking for that collection, convinced it should go to collectors who'd appreciate its investment potential. Watching it displayed in a museum instead, seeing how it's drawn attention to traditional ceramics and helped fund this place, I was wrong about what mattered." Richard paused. "My father tried to buy Caldwell's work for pennies when the pottery was failing. Martin refused, chose to close rather than surrender his art to dealers who only saw profit. I've spent my life angry about that refusal, convinced he was a fool. But standing here, seeing what you've built with the money from his collection, I think maybe he understood something I didn't." After Richard left, Eli stood in the pottery's central courtyard where kilns rose like monuments to an era when beauty and function were inseparable, when craftspeople spent lifetimes mastering skills that created objects meant to last generations. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since Caldwell's time, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. Maya found him there, her hands showing clay stains from the throwing demonstration she'd been giving. "Are you thinking about Mr. Caldwell?" "Yeah. About how he hid his life's work in a chamber nobody could find, trusting that eventually the right person would stumble across it. I was that person only because I was desperate enough to buy a pottery works for salvage. But once you found it, you chose to honor what he wanted rather than just taking the money and running. That choice mattered as much as finding it." Eli pulled his daughter close, feeling pride mixed with the humility of knowing his choice hadn't been particularly heroic, just a man trying to do right because the alternative was living with knowledge that he'd betrayed a dead craftsman's trust for money he desperately needed. But he'd made that choice, had honored Caldwell's intentions, and the result had transformed not just his and Maya's lives but had created something that served community beyond personal benefit. The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the pottery story. Students who'd learned traditional techniques there established their own studios, creating a network of craftspeople who valued quality materials and patient work. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Caldwell's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The museum's Caldwell Legacy Collection became one of its most popular permanent exhibitions, drawing visitors from across the country who came to see work that had been hidden for 40 years and was now preserved for future generations. The admission fees and gift shop sales funded additional acquisitions of American art pottery, created a cycle where Caldwell's hidden treasure continued generating value that served preservation rather than private profit. Eli turned 50 at the Pottery Works, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the building's restoration and by Caldwell's preserved legacy. Former students and current teachers, community members who'd watched the transformation from abandoned ruin to thriving heritage site, even Richard Foster who'd made peace with choices he'd initially opposed. Maya gave him a gift that day that made his chest tight with emotion, a vase she'd created herself using techniques Caldwell would have recognized, thrown on one of the vintage wheels and fired in the restored kilns. The glaze showed her developing mastery of chemistry and art, the form demonstrating skill that came from years of patient practice. "You taught me that some things are worth more than money," she said as he examined the piece. "That honoring someone's trust matters even when taking shortcuts would be easier." Mr. Caldwell hid his work for someone who'd understand what it represented. "You founded and honored that trust. Now I'm learning the skills he practiced, carrying forward knowledge he preserved." As evening settled over the pottery works and the celebration wound down, Eli walked alone through the production floor where Caldwell had created both commercial pottery and the hidden masterworks that had funded this building's restoration. The kilns stood quiet but ready, their brick structures solid after careful restoration, their spaces holding heat from the day's firings. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the eviction notice and desperate auction bid, about finding a hidden chamber because he'd been thorough enough to notice flooring that didn't match. He'd stumbled into preserving Caldwell's legacy through desperation meeting opportunity, through choices made to honor trust rather than maximize immediate profit. The pottery had given him more than the money that saved his family from homelessness. It had given him purpose that transcended personal survival, had created an institution that served community by preserving and teaching skills the modern world was rapidly forgetting. Caldwell's hidden fortune had been both the art itself and the trust he'd placed in whoever found it, the faith that eventually someone would come along who'd understand what mattered more than market value. Eli stood in the courtyard where apprentices had learned their craft for over a century, looking at buildings that had been near collapse when he bought them for salvage, that had been restored through money from Caldwell's hidden collection and through conviction that some legacies deserved preservation even when demolition would have been easier. The pottery works hummed with quiet life, its kilns ready for tomorrow's firings, its teaching spaces prepared for students who'd come seeking skills that connected them to traditions older than themselves. Above, stars appeared in patterns that had looked down on this land before the pottery was built, before Caldwell had hidden his masterworks, before Eli had placed his desperate bid. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of buildings being preserved and knowledge being passed forward and people choosing to honor trust even when profit beckoned more seductively. The pottery stood as proof that buried things eventually surfaced, that trust placed in unknown future could be rewarded, that sometimes desperate gambles led to places that mattered more than immediate salvation. Caldwell had hidden his life's work in faith that eventually someone worthy would find it. Eli had found it because he was desperate and thorough, had chosen to honor what he'd discovered rather than exploit it for maximum gain. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you chose to build, not what served your interests but what served truth and beauty in the patient work of creating things meant to last. The pottery preserved Caldwell's vision while serving present needs, taught skills that connected makers to centuries of tradition while adapting to modern circumstances, honored the dead through work that served the living. Eli locked the pottery for the night and walked to his car, his life transformed from the desperate poverty of 10 years ago to the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd built something meaningful from accidental discovery. The building that was supposed to provide emergency salvage income had become a heritage site that would outlive him, that would teach Caldwell's skills to generations who'd never known the man but who'd benefit from his knowledge. The land had kept its secrets and then yielded them to someone whose desperation made him thorough enough to find what had been hidden. Caldwell's trust had been rewarded through circumstances he couldn't have predicted, a broke single father buying pottery works for salvage, finding a chamber nobody else had noticed, choosing to honor a dead craftsman's intentions despite desperate need for money the collection could have provided. The pottery would stand long after Eli was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge that connected present practice to centuries of tradition. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in clay and fire, in patient craftsmanship and stubborn refusal to let important knowledge disappear, in understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. As he drove home past fields that had watched the potteries rise and fall and rise again, Eli felt the weight of 10 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue, but closure on the journey that had started with an eviction notice and a desperate auction bid and had led to preservation of beauty that would have been scattered if he'd chosen profit over principle. The pottery breathed in the darkness, its kilns cooling, its structure solid, its purpose renewed through choices made to honor trust rather than exploit opportunity. Caldwell's fortune had been found and properly valued, his legacy preserved for people who'd recognize its worth beyond market price, his faith in unknown future rewarded by someone who'd stumbled into the right choice because doing wrong would have meant betraying trust he couldn't quite bring himself to violate. That was the real treasure, not the money that had saved his family, though that mattered, but the knowledge that sometimes broken people in desperate circumstances chose to do right even when wrong would have been easier and more profitable. The pottery stood as monument to that choice, to the understanding that some things were worth preserving even when the cost was high and the profit uncertain. The Pottery Works' 15th anniversary arrived on a morning when frost still clung to the brick courtyard, the November air carrying the same cold clarity it had the day Eli first walked through the abandoned buildings with Maya and a heart full of desperate calculations. The building had aged differently now, not with decay but with the patina that comes from constant use and careful maintenance, its bricks holding warmth from kilns that fired regularly, its windows showing light from workshops where craftspeople practiced skills most of the world had abandoned. Eli stood in the restored office where he'd first found the hidden chamber, now converted to a small museum displaying Caldwell's tools and journals alongside photographs documenting the pottery's transformation from ruin to heritage site. The floor where he'd pried up boards remained visible behind protective glass, a reminder of how discovery had happened, not through systematic search but through desperate thoroughness, through a broke father looking carefully at every aspect of a building he needed to salvage. Maya was 25 now, held a master's degree in ceramic arts, and had returned to the pottery as its education director after spending 3 years studying traditional techniques in Japan and studying museum curation in graduate school. She'd developed her own artistic voice while honoring the traditions Caldwell had practiced, created work that bridged historical methods with contemporary aesthetics, had become exactly the kind of craftsperson Caldwell would have recognized as worthy heir to his knowledge. The anniversary celebration drew people from across the country, former students who'd established their own studios, museum curators who'd worked on the Caldwell Legacy exhibition, collectors who'd donated additional pieces to expand the permanent collection, educators who'd developed programs based on the pottery's teaching model. The courtyard filled with conversations about craft and preservation, about the value of maintaining traditional skills even when modern efficiency offered easier alternatives. Dr. Sarah Chin gave the keynote address, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades advocating for American art pottery preservation. 15 years ago, Eli Brennan bought this building for $400, planning to salvage materials and sell them for scrap. What he found instead was Martin Caldwell's hidden legacy, hundreds of masterworks sealed away because Caldwell couldn't bear to see them scattered among collectors who'd value profit over beauty. Eli could have sold that collection quickly for immediate gain. Instead, he chose to honor Caldwell's trust, to ensure the work stayed together and was properly preserved. She paused, looking around at the restored Pottery Works. But that wasn't the end of the story. The money from the museum acquisition could have simply provided personal security. Instead, Eli invested it in restoring this building, in creating a place where Caldwell's techniques could be learned and practiced, where knowledge he'd spent a lifetime accumulating could be passed forward to new generations. That choice transformed personal discovery into community resource, turned private fortune into public good. The Riverside Art Museum's director spoke next, discussing how the Caldwell Legacy Collection had become their most visited permanent exhibition, how it had sparked renewed interest in traditional American ceramics, how it had inspired donors to support additional acquisitions. The collection's value has only increased over 15 years, he said. Initial appraisals estimated $2 to $3 million. Current market values suggest $5 to $7 million. But more importantly, keeping the collection together and accessible has educated hundreds of thousands of visitors about craftsmanship and beauty that mass production can't replicate. Richard Foster was in the audience, his presence still surprising even after years of reconciliation. He'd become an unexpected advocate for the pottery, using his art dealing connections to support traditional ceramics education, directing potential donors toward the works rather than trying to acquire pieces for private sale. After the speeches, he approached Eli with an expression that showed how much had changed since their first confrontational meeting. "I've been thinking about the first time we met," Richard said. "How angry I was that you wouldn't sell, how convinced I was that you were wasting opportunity by giving the collection to a museum. I spent 40 years chasing Caldwell's final work, believing it should go to collectors who'd appreciate its investment value. I was completely wrong about what mattered. You weren't wrong about the collection's value. Just about what should be done with it. Value and worth aren't the same thing. The collection is worth millions as investment, but its value, its real value, is in what it's taught people about beauty and craft and the importance of preserving knowledge even when the market doesn't support it." Richard gestured toward the restored kilns. "This place exists because you understood that difference, because you chose worth over value when choosing the reverse would have been easier and more profitable." The anniversary exhibition featured work from students and teachers spanning the Pottery's 15 years of operation, showing how skills had been learned and refined and passed forward. Beginner bowls stood alongside master craftsmen's complex sculptural pieces, demonstrating the range of what the pottery enabled. Each piece carried a small placard noting the maker, the date, and often a brief statement about what traditional ceramics meant to them. Maya's contribution was a large vase that showed how far she'd come from the 10-year-old girl who'd first seen what lay beneath the office floor. The form was classical, honoring Caldwell's aesthetic, but the glazing showed innovation that came from understanding chemistry deeply enough to experiment successfully. The accompanying statement read, "Created using techniques Martin Caldwell practiced, taught to me by craftspeople he inspired, fired in kilns he would recognize. Tradition isn't about copying the past, it's about understanding it well enough to carry it forward." Eli stood before his daughter's work feeling pride mixed with the humility of knowing his role had been primarily about not interfering with her development, about creating circumstances where she could learn from people more skilled than himself. He'd stumbled into preserving Caldwell's legacy, but Maya had chosen to dedicate herself to it, had made the Pottery's mission her life's work in ways that went beyond his accidental discovery. A young couple approached him during the reception, introducing themselves as Marcus and Jennifer Webb. No relation, they clarified quickly, just unfortunate coincidence of surname. "We drove 8 hours to be here," Marcus said. "I'm a high school shop teacher, trying to convince my district to add ceramics to our program. My administrator thinks it's a waste of resources, that kids need computer skills not clay throwing. But I brought her here last year, showed her what you've built, and she finally approved funding." "Because of what you saw here?" Eli asked. "Because of what the students here were learning. Not just how to make pottery, but patience and attention to detail and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful through careful work. Those are skills that transfer to everything else." Marcus paused. "Our program starts next semester. We're using your curriculum model, bought 3 of your restored vintage wheels. You've created something that's spreading beyond this building." After the celebration wound down, after most visitors had left and the Pottery settled into evening quiet, Eli found Maya in the production studio reviewing plans for the next teaching semester. She'd spread course schedules across the long wooden tables where apprentices had worked for over a century, was making notes about which instructors would teach which techniques, which students were ready for advanced work. "You've built something remarkable here," Eli said. "Caldwell would be proud. We built it together. You found his collection, made the choice to honor his trust, invested the money in restoration rather than just taking personal security. I just continued what you started. No, you transformed it. I stumbled into doing the right thing because I couldn't figure out how to do wrong without betraying trust I'd inherited. But you chose this work deliberately, made it your life's purpose in ways that go beyond my accidental discovery." Maya set down her pen, meeting her father's eyes. "You taught me what mattered by example. That day you found the hidden chamber, you could have sold everything quickly for money we desperately needed. Instead you took time to understand what Caldwell wanted, to honor intentions he'd written in a journal nobody had to read. That showed me integrity looks like when it costs something real." The Pottery's impact had spread beyond just ceramics education over 15 years. The building itself had become a model for adaptive reuse of industrial heritage, showing how abandoned structures could be restored and repurposed while maintaining historical character. architecture students studied the renovation, preservationists cited it in arguments for saving other old potteries and mills and factories that represented important industrial history. The surrounding neighborhood had stabilized and improved, other buildings finding new uses as the pottery drew visitors who spent money at local businesses. The economic impact was modest but meaningful, the kind of gentle revitalization that happened when heritage was preserved rather than demolished for development that might never materialize. The museum's Caldwell Legacy Collection had inspired additional research into other lost or hidden collections, had sparked interest in documenting craftspeople before their knowledge died with them. Several other museums had established similar programs, seeking out elderly artisans and recording their techniques, preserving knowledge that would have been lost when they died. Caldwell's hidden fortune had triggered a broader movement about valuing craft knowledge while practitioners were still alive to share it. Patricia Morrison, a distant cousin of Martin Caldwell who'd been located during the collection's authentication, had become involved with the Pottery's governance, serving on its advisory board and contributing family history that added context to Caldwell's work. She'd shared letters and photographs that showed the man behind the masterworks, had helped create interpretive displays that made him human rather than just legendary. Martin was difficult, Patricia said during one board meeting, her honesty refreshing after years of hagiography about Caldwell's genius. Perfectionist, demanding, impossible to satisfy. He drove away his wife and children through obsession with his work, died alone because he'd prioritized craft over relationships. The pottery you've built honors his skills while avoiding his mistakes, teaching people to value craftsmanship without sacrificing human connection. The observation had shaped how the pottery approached education, emphasizing that traditional skills mattered but shouldn't consume practitioners to the exclusion of everything else. Students learned to throw pots and mix glazes, but they also learned about sustainable practice, about balancing craft with life, about avoiding the isolation that had marked Caldwell's final years. 20 years after Eli had bought the pottery for salvage, the works hosted a special exhibition marking the anniversary with a comprehensive show of Caldwell's influence on contemporary ceramics. The museum loaned selected pieces from the Legacy Collection. Current students created work responding to Caldwell's techniques. Professional ceramicists who'd studied at the Pottery contributed pieces showing how his methods informed their practice. Eli was 62 now, his role at the Pottery gradually shifting from active management to elder advisory, his daughter having long since assumed primary leadership. His health had started showing age's effects, joints that ached in cold weather, vision that required stronger glasses, but he still came to the Pottery daily, still felt connected to the building and the mission in ways that transcended employment. Maya had married a sculptor she'd met during graduate school, a man named David who understood the pottery's importance to her and who'd relocated to support her work. They had a daughter of their own now, 3-year-old Sarah, who showed early fascination with clay and wheels, who might become another generation carrying forward knowledge Caldwell had preserved. Watching his granddaughter shape clay with small hands, seeing Maya guide her with patient instruction that echoed the teaching she'd received, Eli felt the continuity of what had started with a desperate auction bid and a hidden chamber discovered through thorough necessity. Caldwell's legacy lived not just in preserved masterworks but in skills being learned and practiced and passed forward, in understanding that some knowledge was worth maintaining even when economic forces suggested abandonment. The Pottery's endowment had grown through careful management and additional donations, had reached a level that ensured sustainability beyond any individual's involvement. The building would continue operating after Eli died, after Maya eventually retired, after everyone currently involved had moved on. That permanence felt important, felt like honoring Caldwell's trust in ways that extended beyond the initial choice to preserve rather than scatter his collection. Richard Foster died peacefully at 79, his final years spent supporting traditional crafts rather than acquiring them for profit. His obituary mentioned his evolution from aggressive collector to preservation advocate, noting that his conversion had come from watching how the Caldwell Legacy Collection was used to educate rather than enrich private collectors. His family donated his personal collection of American art pottery to the museum, expanding the permanent exhibition with pieces that complemented Caldwell's work. Dr. Sarachan retired from teaching at 81, her final lecture given at the Pottery Works to students who'd never known a world where Caldwell's final collection remained hidden. She spoke about the importance of preservation, about how art that stayed locked in vaults served no one, about how Eli's choice to honor trust over profit had created ripples that extended far beyond one collection's disposition. 20 years ago, a desperate single father bought this building for salvage, Sarah said, her voice still strong despite her age. He found Martin Caldwell's hidden masterworks and faced a choice: sell quickly for money he desperately needed, or honor the trust Caldwell had placed in whoever discovered them. He chose honor, and that choice preserved not just pottery but knowledge, not just art but the techniques that created it. The Pottery Works exists because one person chose worth over value when choosing the reverse would have been understandable and profitable. The building itself showed 2 decades of careful use and maintenance, its brick walls solid, its kilns functioning as reliably as when Caldwell had fired them, its spaces adapted and updated while maintaining historical character. The restoration had been so thorough that architectural preservation societies cited it as exemplary adaptive reuse, showing how industrial heritage could be saved and repurposed without destroying what made it historically significant. On quiet evenings, after students and staff had gone home, Eli sometimes walked through the pottery alone, moving through spaces that held 20 years of accumulated memory layered over the century of history that had preceded his involvement. The production floor where hundreds of people had learned traditional techniques. The kilns that had been cold and crumbling when he first saw them, now firing regularly with the same patient care Caldwell had employed. The office where he'd found the hidden chamber that changed everything. He thought often about that November morning 2 decades ago, about lifting floorboards and discovering what Caldwell had sealed away, about the choice that had followed. He'd been desperate then, had needed salvage income to avoid homelessness, had every practical reason to just sell the collection quickly and take money that would solve immediate crisis. But something about Caldwell's journal entry had stopped him, about the faith placed in unknown future, about trust that someone would understand what mattered more than market value. That trust had shaped the 20 years that followed, had transformed his life and Maya's, had created an institution that served hundreds of people annually. The pottery didn't just preserve Caldwell's techniques, it embodied his belief that craftsmanship had value beyond profit, that beauty created through patient skill mattered even when mass production offered cheaper alternatives. Maya found him during one of these quiet walks, understanding without words why he came here in evening solitude. They stood together in the courtyard where apprentices had learned their craft for over a century, looking at buildings that had nearly been demolished for salvage, that had been saved through money from Caldwell's hidden fortune and through conviction that some legacies deserved preservation. "Do you ever regret it?" Maya asked. "Taking the museum deal instead of selling the collection for maximum profit? You could have been wealthy instead of just comfortable." Eli considered this honestly, wanting to give his daughter truth rather than noble lies. Sometimes, early on when money was tight and restoration costs exceeded estimates. But mostly no. Wealth you gain by betraying trust sits differently than money earned honestly. "I'd have always known I'd scattered Caldwell's life work for profit when he'd specifically asked whoever found it to do better. And you did better. Built something that honors his craft while serving people he never knew. That's worth more than money in a vault." Maybe. Or maybe I just got lucky that doing right worked out, that the museum deal provided enough security that honoring trust didn't destroy us financially. If circumstances had been different, if choosing right had left us homeless, I'd like to think I'd still feel good about the choice. But I don't actually know. "You know," Maya said with quiet certainty. "Because you've spent 20 years building something that could have been just transaction, could have been simple salvage and sale and moving on. Instead you created a place that preserves knowledge and teaches skills and honors a dead craftsman's trust. That's character, not luck." The pottery's 25th anniversary approached with Eli now 70 and showing age's accumulated effects more obviously. He'd stepped back from daily operations entirely, though he still attended board meetings and major events, still felt connected to the building and its mission in ways that transcended formal involvement. Maya had become the pottery's director in both name and practice, had developed programs and partnerships that expanded its reach while maintaining its core commitment to traditional techniques. The anniversary celebration would be Eli's last major public appearance, a fact everyone understood though nobody stated explicitly. His health had declined steadily over the past year, his body finally claiming payment for decades of hard work and earlier poverty's toll. But he was determined to see the quarter-century mark, to witness what had grown from that desperate November morning when he'd bought a pottery works for salvage. The museum arranged a special exhibition reuniting pieces from the Caldwell Legacy collection with work created by students who'd learned his techniques at the Pottery. The juxtaposition showed continuity across generations, demonstrated how knowledge preserved could influence future practitioners, illustrated that Caldwell's trust had been rewarded not just through proper stewardship of his masterworks but through transmission of the skills that created them. Eli stood before the exhibition on opening night, his granddaughter Sarah, now 8 and already showing serious ceramic talent, beside him studying the displays with focused attention. She'd been learning pottery since she was old enough to safely approach a wheel, had absorbed knowledge through proximity to skilled craftspeople in the same organic way Maya had learned. Great-Grandpa Caldwell made beautiful things, Sarah said, looking at a vase that showed Caldwell's mastery of form and glaze. He did. And your grandpa found them when they'd been hidden for a long time, made sure they stayed together so people could learn from them. And now Mom teaches people the same skills. And someday I'll teach people too. Sarah spoke with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who'd grown up around multi-generational knowledge transmission, who saw nothing unusual about skills being passed forward through careful instruction and patient practice. Eli felt emotion tighten his chest, recognizing that what had started with desperate salvage bid had become self-sustaining tradition, that Caldwell's knowledge would continue being taught long after everyone currently involved had died. That was legacy in its purest form, not preserved objects but living practice, not frozen history but skills that remained relevant through adaptation to present needs while maintaining historical roots. The speeches that night honored not just Caldwell's artistic achievement or the pottery's quarter-century of operation, but the choice Eli had made 25 years earlier to honor trust when exploiting it would have been easier and more immediately profitable. Maya spoke about her father's character, about learning integrity through watching how he handled discovery that could have served purely selfish ends but instead became foundation for community resource. My father could have sold Martin Caldwell's collection quickly, could have taken money and walked away, could have chosen survival over honor when survival was genuinely at stake, Maya said, her voice carrying across the packed gallery. Instead he chose to ask what Caldwell wanted, to honor trust placed in unknown future, to build something that served more than just personal need. That choice taught me more about character than any lecture could have, showed me that integrity means something even when circumstances make shortcuts tempting. The pottery would continue after Eli was gone, would keep teaching and firing and preserving knowledge that connected present practice to centuries of tradition. That continuation felt like the proper ending to a story that had started with desperation and hidden treasure and choices made to honor trust rather than exploit opportunity. Caldwell's legacy lived in every pot thrown by students who'd learned his techniques, in every piece created using methods he'd practiced, in the understanding that some knowledge was worth maintaining even when the market suggested abandonment. Eli died quietly at 72, peacefully in his sleep after a final day spent at the pottery watching his granddaughter learn to send her clay on a wheel. His funeral filled the pottery's central courtyard, craftspeople and students and community members gathering to honor someone who'd stumbled into preserving important heritage through desperate need meeting careful thoroughness. Maya spoke at the service, her voice steady despite grief. My father bought this building for $400 because we needed money desperately. He found Martin Caldwell's hidden masterworks and could have sold them quickly for fortune we couldn't imagine. Instead he chose to honor what Caldwell wanted, to preserve rather than scatter, to build something that served beauty and knowledge instead of just profit. That choice defined who he was, someone who did right even when circumstances made wrong understandable. The pottery work stood witness to the service, its brick walls solid after careful restoration, its kilns ready for tomorrow's firings even as they honored someone who'd ensured they had tomorrow. The building had transformed through Eli's choices from derelict salvage site to heritage center, had become something that honored Caldwell's trust while serving present needs, had created continuity that would outlive everyone currently involved. The land stretched away in patterns older than human occupation, had held secrets Caldwell sealed and had yielded them when circumstances brought someone worthy to discover them. The creek still flowed past the pottery's boundaries, the soil still remembered everything that had happened here, the fields still bore witness to transformation from ruin to renewal through choices made to honor trust over profit. Maya became the pottery's next generation of leadership, carrying forward mission her father had accidentally created through desperate auction bid and discovered chamber. She taught her daughter Sarah as she'd been taught, passed forward knowledge Caldwell had preserved through craft practiced daily rather than just admired in museums. The pottery thrived under her direction, expanded programs while maintaining core commitment to traditional techniques, ensured Caldwell's legacy continued influencing new generations. The building stood solid and purposeful, alive with the sound of wheels turning and kilns firing and teachers instructing students in skills most of the world had abandoned. Caldwell's masterworks remained safely preserved in the museum, accessible to people who'd never have seen them if they'd been scattered among private collectors. His techniques remained actively practiced in the pottery, taught to students who carried them forward and adapted them to present circumstances while maintaining historical roots. That was the real treasure Eli had found beneath the office floor, not just masterwork pottery worth millions, but trust placed in unknown future that someone would honor what mattered more than market value. He'd honored that trust through choices that transformed personal discovery into community resource, that preserved beauty and knowledge rather than exploiting them for maximum profit. The pottery stood as monument to those choices, to understanding that some legacies required stewardship rather than ownership, preservation rather than possession. Years passed like seasons, the pottery continuing its work of teaching and firing and preserving knowledge through practice rather than just documentation. Students who'd learned their established studios across the country, created network of craftspeople who valued traditional techniques adapted to modern circumstances. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured Caldwell's knowledge wouldn't die with any single generation. The museum's Caldwell Legacy Collection became increasingly valuable as years passed and appreciation for traditional American ceramics grew. Initial appraisals of $2 to $3 million had proven conservative. Current estimates suggested $10 to $15 million for the complete collection. But the pieces remained together and accessible, serving education rather than enriching private collectors, honoring both Caldwell's intentions and Eli's choice to preserve rather than scatter. Sarah grew into her role as third-generation practitioner of Caldwell's techniques, developed her own artistic voice while maintaining connection to traditions her grandfather had found and her mother had taught her. She spoke often about the pottery's founding story, about desperate auction bid and hidden chamber and choice to honor trust when exploiting it would have been easier. The story had become part of the pottery's identity, reminder that how a heritage was stewarded mattered as much as the heritage itself. On the pottery's 30th anniversary, now run by Maya and supported by Sarah and guided by advisory board that included collectors and educators and community members, the works hosted a comprehensive exhibition about Caldwell's life and legacy. The show traced his evolution from production potter to artist, documented the hidden chamber's discovery, showed how preservation choices had influenced subsequent generations. The exhibition's final section focused on what had grown from Eli's choice to honor Caldwell's trust, the pottery works itself, the students who'd learned there, the broader revival of interest in traditional American ceramics, the understanding that knowledge preserved through practice mattered more than objects locked in vaults. Pictures showed the building's transformation from ruin to heritage site, documented the thousands of people who'd learned traditional techniques, traced the network of studios and programs the pottery had inspired. Maya stood before the display showing her father's role in the story, the section that explained how desperate single-parent buying salvage rights had discovered hidden masterworks and chosen preservation over profit. The text was honest about Eli's initial desperation, about the eviction notice and the financial crisis that had driven him to bid on property nobody else wanted. It didn't make him heroic, just human, someone who'd stumbled into doing right because doing wrong would have meant betraying trust he couldn't quite violate even when circumstances made violation understandable. Sarah joined her mother, both of them studying the man whose choice had shaped their lives and the lives of hundreds of people who'd learned at the pottery. He could have taken the easy path, Sarah said. Could have sold the collection quickly and walked away wealthy. Instead he built this place, created something that serves people he'd never meet. That's legacy. That's character, Maya corrected gently. Legacy is what follows from character, the choices you make when circumstances test who you actually are versus who you'd like to believe you are. Dad chose to honor a dead craftsman's trust when he desperately needed money that trust's violation would have provided. Everything else followed from that choice. The pottery hummed with evening activity, kilns firing and students working, and the sound of wheels turning as clay was shaped by hands learning skills Caldwell had practiced. The building breathed differently than it had when Eli first entered 3 decades ago, alive rather than dying, purposeful rather than abandoned, serving a function that honored both past and present while pointing toward future continuation. Above, stars appeared in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and choices, witnessing the patient work of buildings being preserved and knowledge being transmitted and people choosing to honor trust even when circumstances made betrayal tempting. The pottery stood as proof that what was worth preserving could be preserved, that trust placed in unknown future could be rewarded, that sometimes the right choice led to places more valuable than immediate profit. The land remembered everything, the pottery's century of operation, Caldwell's years of creating hidden masterworks, the decades of abandonment, Eli's desperate purchase and discovery and choice to honor trust, the transformation that followed. The creek flowed as it had for millennia, the soil held every story, the fields bore witness to continuity across generations who valued craft and beauty and patient work even when the world suggested faster, easier alternatives. Maya locked the pottery that night thinking about her father and grandfather Caldwell and all the choices that had led to this moment, desperate auction bids and hidden chambers and trust honored across decades. The building stood solid in the darkness, its kilns cooling from the day's firings, its spaces ready for tomorrow's teaching, its purpose clear and sustainable for generations to come. That was legacy in its truest form, not objects preserved or money accumulated, but knowledge transmitted and beauty created in understanding that some things mattered more than profit. The pottery existed because Eli had chosen honor over exploitation when circumstances made exploitation understandable and tempting. That choice had transformed desperation into purpose, personal discovery into community resource, hidden fortune into living tradition. The story would continue being told, of Martin Caldwell hiding his masterworks in faith that someone worthy would find them, of Eli Brennan discovering them through desperate thoroughness and choosing preservation over profit, of Maya and Sarah carrying forward knowledge that connected present practice to century of tradition. Each telling would emphasize different elements, would adapt to different audiences, but the core would remain, trust honored, legacy preserved, choices made to serve beauty and knowledge rather than simply maximizing personal gain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.